The fastest way to miss a fortune is to decide what something is worth before you understand what it is. The auction yard sat on the edge of town beneath a gray morning sky. Rows of abandoned vehicles stretched across acres of cracked pavement. Some were damaged, some were forgotten. Most would eventually be dismantled and sold for parts. Nobody expected to find history there. Nobody expected to find value there, especially not in the faded silver coupe sitting alone near the back fence. Daniel Brooks arrived just after 8 o'clock with his 10-year-old daughter Emily beside him. The old pickup truck they drove looked almost as tired as the vehicles parked around them. Daniel worked 6 days a week at his small repair garage. Every dollar mattered. Every purchase required careful thought. That was why Emily immediately noticed something unusual when her father stopped walking. "Dad?" she asked. Daniel did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the silver coupe. The paint had faded. The tires were flat. Dust covered every surface. At first glance, it looked like every other forgotten vehicle in the yard. Yet Daniel stepped closer, then closer again. Emily followed him. "What are you looking at?" she asked. Daniel knelt beside the front fender. His eyes moved slowly across the body panels. He examined the windshield, the mirrors, the wheels. Then he stood and walked around the vehicle a second time. "I am not sure yet," he said quietly. Emily smiled. She recognized that answer. It was the same answer he always gave when something captured his attention. Across the yard, a crowd had gathered around another vehicle. Cameras flashed. Reporters stood nearby. At the center of the attention was Richard Sterling, one of the most recognizable automobile investors in the country. Richard owned collections worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Television networks interviewed him regularly. Auction houses sought his opinion. When Richard Sterling said a car mattered, collectors listened. When he said it did not matter, they listened even more. As the morning progressed, Richard moved through the auction yard inspecting inventory. Several people followed him closely. Buyers asked questions. Journalists recorded comments. Eventually, he reached the area where Daniel stood examining the silver coupe. Richard barely glanced at the car before laughing softly. "That thing?" he said when someone asked about it. "There is nothing special about it." A few people chuckled. Richard walked around the vehicle once. Wrong condition, wrong history, wrong market. He tapped the roof lightly. "Worth more as storage space than transportation." More laughter followed. The group moved on. Daniel remained silent. Emily looked at the departing crowd. "He seems pretty sure." Daniel continued studying the car. "Maybe." Emily looked back at the coupe. "Do you think he is wrong?" Daniel smiled slightly. "I think he saw exactly what everyone else saw." "And what did you see?" Daniel did not answer. Not immediately. Instead, he opened the driver's side door. It creaked softly. The interior looked worn but complete. His attention settled on a small detail near the dashboard, then another near the center console. Tiny things, easy to miss, easy to dismiss. Yet something about them seemed to matter. Emily noticed the change in his expression. "You found something." Daniel sat quietly for several seconds. Then he closed the door. "Maybe." An hour later, bidding began. Most buyers ignored the silver coupe. Interest remained low. The vehicle received only a few casual offers. Daniel waited patiently. When the final call arrived, he raised his hand. Moments later, the car belonged to him. Several nearby buyers exchanged amused looks. One man shook his head. "You just bought yourself a headache." Another laughed. At least scrap prices are decent.
Daniel thanked them politely and signed the paperwork. Across the yard, Richard noticed the transaction while preparing to leave.
You actually bought that thing? He asked. Daniel nodded. Richard smiled, not cruelly, simply with certainty. The certainty of a man who believed he had already solved the puzzle. Good luck, Richard said. You are going to need it. Daniel thanked him and loaded the paperwork into his truck. Emily climbed into the passenger seat. As they drove away, she looked at the folder resting on her father's lap. You still have that look. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. What look? Emily smiled. The one you get when you think everybody missed something. Daniel glanced toward the mirror where the auction yard slowly disappeared behind them. Then he looked at the registration documents one more time. For a brief moment, his expression changed. Not excitement, not confidence, curiosity. The kind that only appeared when a mystery had just begun. The silver coupe arrived at Daniel's garage just before sunset. The tow truck driver unloaded it beside the service bay and handed over the keys. You sure about this one? He asked. Daniel smiled. Not yet. The driver laughed and pulled away. Emily stood nearby watching the car more carefully than before. Ever since the auction, she had noticed something unusual about her father's behavior. He was curious. Not excited, not confident. Curious. That usually meant a mystery had appeared. And mysteries had a habit of becoming important. Daniel rolled the vehicle into the garage and switched on the overhead lights. The faded paint looked even older indoors. Dust covered every surface. The seats showed years of wear. Nothing about it suggested extraordinary value, at least not to most people. Emily walked around the coupe slowly. It still looks like a normal old car. Daniel nodded. That is exactly what makes it interesting. She frowned. I do not understand. Daniel opened the driver's door again and pointed toward a small section beneath the dashboard. See this? Emily leaned closer. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed it. A tiny metal plate attached with fasteners that did not match the rest of the interior. That looks different. Daniel nodded. It should not be there. Emily looked confused. Maybe somebody repaired it. Maybe. Daniel used a flashlight to examine the surrounding area. Then he moved toward the trunk. A few minutes later, he found another detail. Then another. None of them were dramatic. None of them proved anything. Yet they all raised questions. And Daniel had learned long ago that valuable discoveries often began with questions. The next morning, he started researching the vehicle's history, registration records, ownership transfers, maintenance reports, auction documents. Most of the information looked ordinary, until one detail did not. Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds before printing the page. Emily arrived after school and found him comparing paperwork across the workbench. Did you find something? She asked. Daniel slid 2 documents toward her. Read the dates. Emily studied them carefully. One ownership record showed a transfer that should have occurred years before another document was issued. The timeline did not make sense. That is impossible. Daniel nodded slowly. Exactly. So somebody made a mistake? Emily asked. Daniel folded his arms. Maybe. There was that word again. Maybe. By late afternoon, Daniel had uncovered several more inconsistencies. Small discrepancies, tiny gaps, missing pieces. None of them meant much individually. Together, they created a strange picture. It was almost as if part of the vehicle's history had disappeared.
That evening, while cleaning the interior, Emily discovered something else. A small folded paper wedged deep beneath the seat bracket. "Dad?" Daniel walked over immediately. The paper looked old, extremely old. He unfolded it carefully. Most of the writing had faded. Only a few lines remained readable. Emily watched his expression change. Not excitement, not certainty.
Curiosity becoming stronger.
"What is it?" she asked.
Daniel read the note again, then once more. "I am not sure."
Emily smiled. "That means it is important."
Daniel laughed quietly. She was learning too much. Outside, the garage grew darker as evening settled across town. Inside, the silver coupe sat beneath the lights, looking exactly the same as it had the day before. Dusty, ordinary, forgettable. Yet Daniel could not shake the feeling that the car was hiding something. Not because it looked valuable, because too many things about its story refused to fit together. And somewhere inside those missing pieces, he suspected the real answer was waiting. The following morning, Daniel decided to stop looking at the car as a mechanic and start looking at it as a historian. The difference mattered. A mechanic asks, what is broken? A historian asks, what happened? By 7 o'clock, the workbench inside the garage had disappeared beneath paperwork. Registration documents, auction records, insurance forms, old maintenance receipts. Every piece of information pointed toward the same vehicle. Yet the story they told refused to stay consistent. Emily arrived carrying 2 breakfast sandwiches and immediately noticed the growing collection of papers. That cannot be normal. Daniel accepted one sandwich without looking away from the documents. It is not. Emily sat beside him. More missing information? Daniel nodded. And something else. He slid a file across the table. Look at the ownership timeline. Emily studied the page carefully. The vehicle appeared to change hands several times over 2 decades. Most transfers looked ordinary. One did not. A 3-year period seemed almost completely blank. No clear ownership, no maintenance history, no inspection records. Nothing. Where did it go? She asked. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That is the question. Later that afternoon, he visited the county records office. The building was quiet and mostly forgotten, much like the car itself. An older clerk helped him search archived documents. After nearly 2 hours, they uncovered a storage registration connected to the vehicle's identification number. Daniel expected another dead end. Instead, he found something stranger. The address listed on the record belonged to a private warehouse that no longer existed. That building was demolished years ago, the clerk explained. Nobody has asked about it in a very long time. Daniel thanked him and copied the information. On the drive home, he could not stop thinking about the warehouse. Cars do not simply disappear for years without a reason. That evening, while cleaning dust from the trunk compartment, Emily discovered another unusual detail. Dad? Daniel walked over immediately. She pointed toward the underside of a storage panel. Scratched into the metal was a sequence of letters and numbers. Not a factory marking, not a serial number, something added later. Daniel stared at it for several moments. That should not be there. Emily smiled. You keep saying that. Daniel grabbed a notebook and wrote the sequence down. Then he compared it to the faded note they had discovered beneath the seat. For a moment, the garage became completely silent. Emily noticed the change in his expression. What happened? Daniel looked from the paper to the notebook and back again. I think they match.
Who matches? Daniel folded the note carefully and placed it beside the paperwork. I do not know who. He looked toward the silver coupe resting beneath the overhead lights. But somebody wanted this car to be found. Outside, darkness settled across the town. Inside the garage, the mystery continued growing larger, because for the first time since the auction, Daniel no longer believed the missing history was accidental. Someone had hidden the story, and someone else had left clues behind. The next day, Daniel drove to the location listed in the old warehouse records.
Emily sat beside him, studying the copied documents, while the silver coupe remained back at the garage. The address led them to an empty lot on the edge of an industrial district. Nothing remained except cracked concrete and a rusted chain-link fence.
This was the warehouse? Emily asked. Daniel nodded. According to the records. She looked around. Does not seem very helpful. Daniel smiled faintly. Sometimes the place is gone, but the people are not. That idea stayed with him throughout the afternoon. Back at the garage, he began searching through local archives, old business directories, and historical property records. Hours passed. Most of the information led nowhere. Then a name appeared repeatedly beside the warehouse address. A maintenance contractor. A man named Harold Mercer.
The record was over 20 years old. Daniel did not expect much. Yet by early evening, he managed to locate a phone number. The voice that answered sounded elderly but alert. Daniel explained why he was calling. Silence followed for several seconds. "You still have that car?" the man finally asked. Daniel exchanged a glance with Emily. "You know the car?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I remember it." Daniel immediately sat forward. "Can we meet?" The old man agreed. The following morning, Daniel and Emily arrived at a small house outside town. Harold Mercer greeted them on the front porch. He moved slowly, but his eyes remained sharp. Daniel showed him several photographs of the coupe. Harold studied them carefully. Then something unexpected happened. The old man smiled, not because the vehicle looked valuable, because he recognized it. "I have not seen that car in a very long time," he said quietly. Emily leaned forward. "Who owned it?" Harold looked at the photograph again. "That is the funny thing." He pointed toward the image. "The person everybody thought owned it was not the person who mattered." Daniel felt his curiosity sharpen immediately. "What does that mean?" Harold walked inside and returned carrying an old storage box. Dust covered the lid. Time had faded the cardboard, yet he handled it carefully, almost respectfully. Inside were photographs, invoices, and handwritten notes dating back decades. Daniel turned the pages slowly. Most showed workshops, transport trucks, and automotive events. Then one photograph stopped him cold. It showed the silver coupe years earlier. The paint was different. The condition was perfect. More importantly, the vehicle stood beside someone whose face had been partially cut from the image. "Why remove the person?" Emily asked. Harold stared at the photograph for a long moment. "Because after certain events happened, some people wanted that story forgotten." The room became very quiet. Daniel looked at the old photograph again, then at the mysterious note found beneath the seat, then at the strange identification markings hidden inside the car. For the first time, the scattered clues no longer felt random. They felt connected. And whatever history someone had tried to erase, it was beginning to surface. Daniel spent the rest of the afternoon studying the contents of Harold's storage box. Every photograph revealed another piece of a story that nobody seemed willing to discuss openly. Emily sat beside him at the garage office table while they organized the material into a timeline. Some images showed the silver coupe at automotive events. Others showed it inside workshops. A few included groups of people standing around the vehicle. Yet one pattern appeared repeatedly. The same face had been removed from nearly every photograph, sometimes carefully, sometimes crudely, but always intentionally. Whoever that person was, Emily said, someone really wanted them erased. Daniel nodded. Looks that way. He picked up another photograph and examined the background. This time his attention settled on something unexpected, a banner hanging behind the vehicle. Most of the lettering had faded. Only a few words remained visible, but one was still readable. Heritage Invitational. Daniel immediately reached for his laptop. Several minutes later, he found archived information about the event. It had been one of the most prestigious private automotive gatherings in the country decades earlier. Invitations were limited. Attendance was exclusive. Vehicles shown there often became part of collector history. Yet when Daniel searched for records connected to the silver coupe, almost nothing appeared. That does not make sense, Emily said. If it was important enough to be there, why is there no history? Daniel looked at the screen. Maybe somebody removed it. The answer sounded increasingly likely. Later that evening, another discovery appeared. Hidden among old receipts was a faded business card. On the back, someone had written a phone number and a single name: Leonard Graves. Daniel searched for the name immediately. The result surprised him. Leonard Graves had once been one of the most respected restoration specialists in the industry. He had worked on rare vehicles for collectors around the world. More importantly, he was still alive. The next morning, Daniel made the call. An elderly voice answered. After hearing the description of the vehicle, Leonard became very quiet. "Where did you find that car?" he asked. Daniel explained the auction. Another long silence followed. "I thought it disappeared." Daniel exchanged a glance with Emily. "You know it?" "I knew the story," Leonard replied. "Or at least part of it." By afternoon, Daniel and Emily were sitting inside Leonard's workshop. The building looked like a museum hidden inside an old warehouse. Rare vehicles filled the space. Historical photographs lined the walls. Leonard studied the image of the silver coupe for several moments before nodding slowly. "Yes," he said. "That is the car." Emily leaned forward. "Why is everyone acting like it is a secret?" Leonard smiled sadly. "Because some secrets become expensive." He walked toward a filing cabinet and removed a worn folder. Inside was a photograph Daniel had never seen before. The silver coupe stood beneath bright lights, surrounded by reporters and spectators. Unlike the other pictures, no faces had been removed. Daniel stared at the image. Then he noticed something near the bottom corner: a plaque, a title, an award. His eyes widened slightly. Emily immediately noticed. "What is it?" Daniel looked from the photograph to Leonard. Leonard folded his arms and nodded slowly. "Now you are starting to understand why that car should never have ended up in an auction yard." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Daniel stared at the photograph while Emily leaned closer to see what had captured his attention. The plaque positioned beside the silver coupe contained only a few readable words, but they were enough. The vehicle had not merely appeared at an exclusive event decades earlier. It had won one of the highest honors presented there. Emily looked from the photograph to Leonard. How could a car like that disappear? Leonard sat down slowly. That is the question a lot of people asked at the time. He opened another folder and carefully removed several newspaper clippings. Most were faded beyond recognition. One remained readable. Daniel studied the article. It described the vehicle as a breakthrough design, a machine praised for craftsmanship, engineering, and innovation. Journalists covered it. Collectors discussed it. Experts predicted it would become famous. Then the story abruptly ended. No follow-up articles, no later records, no public history. Almost as if the vehicle had vanished. "What happened?" Daniel asked. Leonard folded his hands. Nobody ever got the full answer. He pointed toward another photograph. But there were rumors. Daniel listened carefully. According to Leonard, the car had been connected to a private project involving several influential investors and automotive figures. Something changed shortly after its public success. Ownership records became difficult to track. Public appearances stopped. Eventually, the vehicle disappeared entirely. Decades passed. Most people assumed it had been destroyed, exported, or hidden inside a private collection. Nobody imagined it would end up forgotten in an auction yard. Emily looked toward the silver coupe in the photograph. So all these years, people were searching for it? Leonard nodded. Some people never stopped. The drive home felt different. Daniel remained unusually quiet. Not because he believed he had solved the mystery, because the mystery had become much larger than he expected. Back at the garage, he rolled the silver coupe beneath brighter lights and began comparing details from the photographs to the vehicle itself. Every hour revealed something new. Small modifications, unique construction features, details that matched the historical images exactly. By midnight, several pieces finally aligned. The unusual plate beneath the dashboard, the strange markings hidden inside the trunk, the missing ownership records, the faded note under the seat. None of them were random. They formed a trail. Emily watched their father studying the evidence spread across the workbench. You believe it now? Daniel looked up. Believe what? That this is the same car? Daniel glanced toward the silver coupe. For the first time since buying it, uncertainty had begun fading. Not completely, but enough. I think it might be. Emily smiled. That is your version of being excited. Daniel laughed quietly. Maybe it was. The following morning, he contacted several respected automotive historians and restoration experts. He sent photographs, documentation, identification details. Then he waited. Responses began arriving throughout the day. The first expert requested additional images. The second asked for serial markings. The third called directly. By evening, one message stood out from all the others. The sender was a nationally recognized collector. The message contained only a single sentence. Daniel read it twice before handing the phone to Emily. Her eyes widened immediately. People are coming here? Daniel nodded slowly. Outside, the garage looked exactly as it always had. Small, ordinary, quiet. Yet within days, experts from across the country would be arriving to examine a vehicle that many believed no longer existed. And for the first time, Daniel realized the story hidden inside the silver coupe was finally beginning to emerge into the light. 3 days later, the first visitors arrived. Then more. By the end of the week, Daniel's small garage looked less like a repair shop and more like a meeting place for automotive historians, collectors, and restoration experts. Expensive vehicles filled the parking lot. Cameras appeared. Questions multiplied. Yet through it all, the silver coupe remained exactly where it had been from the beginning, parked beneath the lights in the center bay. Quiet, unassuming. Emily found the entire situation amusing. A week ago, nobody cared about it. Daniel smiled while organizing paperwork. That happens sometimes. Now everybody cares. Daniel looked toward the growing crowd. That happens too. Throughout the day, experts examined the vehicle in remarkable detail. Identification markings were verified. Historical photographs were compared. Construction details were measured and documented. One by one, conclusions began aligning. The evidence pointed toward the same answer. Not certainty yet, but something very close. Late that afternoon, a nationally known collector named Arthur Bennett arrived. Unlike many of the others, he spent very little time talking. Instead, he walked slowly around the coupe 3 separate times. He studied the body lines, the interior, the unusual details Daniel had discovered during the first days of ownership. Finally, he stepped back and folded his arms. "Do you realize what you may have here?" Daniel glanced toward the vehicle. "I know it matters." Arthur nodded. "More than that." Before he could continue, another familiar face appeared at the garage entrance. Richard Sterling, the billionaire from the auction yard. Several people immediately recognized him. Conversations grew quieter. Richard walked directly toward the silver coupe. Unlike the day of the auction, he did not laugh. He did not dismiss the vehicle. He simply studied it, carefully, for a long time. Emily noticed the difference immediately. "He looks worried." Daniel said nothing. Richard eventually turned toward Arthur Bennett. "You believe it is authentic?" Arthur nodded without hesitation. Every hour the evidence becomes stronger. Richard looked back at the vehicle. For the first time since Daniel met him, uncertainty appeared in his expression. The certainty that had surrounded him at the auction was gone. In its place stood a man realizing he might have overlooked something extraordinary. News spread quickly. Articles appeared online. Collector forums exploded with speculation. Historical photographs surfaced from private archives. Former industry figures began sharing memories. A forgotten story was returning to life. Then came the phone call. Daniel answered while reviewing documentation in his office. The representative on the other end spoke calmly and professionally. After several minutes, Daniel thanked them and ended the call. Emily looked up immediately. "What happened?" Daniel stared at the phone for a moment. "An auction company wants to see the car." Emily blinked. "The big one?" Daniel nodded. She sat quietly for several seconds. "That sounds important." Daniel looked through the office window toward the silver coupe surrounded by experts and collectors. "I think it is." Outside, the crowd continued growing. Inside, the mystery that began with a dusty, forgotten vehicle was entering an entirely new chapter. Because the question was no longer whether the car mattered, the question had become how much the world believed it was worth. 7 days after the auction, Daniel found himself standing inside one of the most prestigious collector auction houses in the country. The transformation felt almost unreal. A week earlier, people had laughed at the silver coupe. Now it sat beneath professional lighting surrounded by cameras, historians, collectors, and industry experts. Emily stood beside her father, staring at the crowd. "There are a lot of people here." Daniel looked around the enormous hall. "Yes." "Do they all want the car?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Looks that way." During the days leading up to the event, verification had continued. More photographs surfaced. Additional documentation appeared. Experts compared historical records. Every new discovery strengthened the same conclusion. The silver coupe was not merely rare. It represented a missing piece of automotive history, something collectors had believed lost for decades. That morning, journalists interviewed specialists near the display platform. Several openly described the vehicle as one of the most unexpected discoveries in recent memory. Daniel listened politely, but remained focused on the car itself. He had never purchased it for attention. He purchased it because something about the story did not make sense. Now the story had become larger than anyone imagined. Across the room, Richard Sterling stood speaking with several collectors. Unlike their first meeting, his attitude had changed completely. The confidence remained. The certainty did not. More than once, Daniel noticed Richard looking toward the silver coupe with quiet frustration. Not because someone else had become wealthy, because he had seen the same car and dismissed it. Emily noticed, too. "He keeps looking over here." Daniel nodded. "Probably. Do you think he wishes he bought it?" Daniel smiled. "I think everybody wishes they bought it." The auction finally began. One vehicle after another crossed the stage. Collectors bid, prices rose, applause followed. Then the silver coupe rolled forward beneath the lights. The room immediately became quieter. The auctioneer spent several minutes describing the vehicle's documented history and recent authentication process. Large screens displayed photographs recovered during the investigation. The audience listened carefully. Then the bidding started. The opening number exceeded what Daniel paid by an amount that made Emily's eyes widen. Yet the bids continued climbing. Higher, then higher again. Within minutes, multiple collectors remained active. Telephone representatives relayed offers from international buyers. The pace accelerated. Daniel remained surprisingly calm. Emily was not. "Dad?" "Yes?" "Is this really happening?" Daniel looked toward the stage. "I think so." The numbers continued rising. Several collectors dropped out. Others remained. Every new bid triggered murmurs across the room. The auctioneer's voice grew increasingly animated. Then the moment arrived. One final exchange, one final increase. Silence followed. The auctioneer looked across the room. "Any further bids?" Nobody responded. The hammer came down. The final price appeared on the screen. $8 million. For a second, the entire room seemed frozen. Then applause erupted throughout the hall. Cameras turned toward Daniel. Journalists rushed forward. Experts smiled. Collectors shook their heads in disbelief. Across the room, Richard Sterling remained seated. Not angry, not bitter, simply silent, watching the result of a decision he once considered foolish. Emily looked up at her father. $8 million. Daniel nodded slowly. The applause continued around them, yet his attention remained on the silver coupe. The same dusty mystery that had sat forgotten in an auction yard only 7 days earlier. The mystery everybody saw, and somehow missed. 3 months later, life looked remarkably similar to the way it had before the auction. The garage still opened at 7 o'clock every morning. Customers still arrived with ordinary problems: oil changes, brake repairs, engine diagnostics. The same familiar routines continued. Yet one thing had changed forever. People now knew Daniel Brooks. Not because he chased attention, because he had uncovered something extraordinary by paying attention when everyone else looked away. The money from the auction solved problems that had followed him for years. The garage received new equipment. Deferred repairs on the building were finally completed. Emily's future became a little more secure. Beyond that, very little changed. Daniel still wore the same work clothes, still arrived early, still preferred solving mechanical puzzles over speaking to reporters. One afternoon, while organizing tools in the service bay, he noticed a familiar luxury vehicle pull into the parking lot. Richard Sterling stepped out alone. No cameras, no assistants, no audience. Just a billionaire walking toward a small garage. Daniel greeted him politely. Richard looked around the building before speaking. "This place looks exactly the same." Daniel smiled. Mostly. Richard nodded. For several moments, neither man said anything. Finally, Richard looked toward the workbench. I have spent weeks thinking about that auction. Daniel waited. Richard shook his head and laughed softly. The funny thing is that I saw the same car you saw. Daniel nodded. You did. I walked around it. You did. Richard folded his arms. And I still missed it. Daniel glanced toward the service bay. Happens to everybody. Richard smiled. Not usually for $8 million. Both men laughed. The tension disappeared immediately. After a few minutes, Richard became serious again. What made the difference? Daniel thought about the question carefully. Then he looked toward the office window where Emily sat finishing homework. I was curious. Richard followed his gaze. That is all? Most discoveries start there. Richard remained quiet. Then he nodded slowly. Perhaps because he understood. Perhaps because he finally saw the lesson hidden inside the entire story. Before leaving, Richard extended his hand. Daniel shook it. No rivalry remained. No resentment. Only mutual respect. As the luxury vehicle disappeared down the road, Emily walked into the garage. Did he finally understand? She asked. Daniel smiled. I think so. Good. She sat on the workbench and looked around the garage. You know what is funny? What? Emily pointed toward the corner where the silver coupe had once sat beneath the lights. Everybody thought the car was the treasure. Daniel waited. But it was not. He raised an eyebrow. No. Emily shook her head. The treasure was figuring out the truth. Daniel looked at her for several seconds before smiling. She was right. The money mattered. The history mattered. The auction mattered. But the real value had been hidden somewhere deeper. Inside questions nobody asked. Inside clues everybody ignored. Inside a mystery that rewarded patience instead of assumptions. As evening settled outside, Daniel switched off the garage lights and locked the front door. Together, he and Emily walked toward the pickup truck parked beneath the fading sky. Behind them stood the same small garage. Ahead of them waited whatever came next. And somewhere in the distance, a forgotten silver coupe was beginning a new chapter in someone else's collection. But the lesson it left behind remained simple. Sometimes the world tells you exactly what something is worth. The wisest people are the ones who take the time to look for themselves.